With words, there are subtle changes. Signals that go unnoticed until suddenly everything feels different. You've noticed that something's off. That the connection you used to have is no longer there. But you can't quite figure out what has changed. It's unsettling, I know. The uncertainty consumes you. And you wonder if it's all in your head. Or if there's something more she's not telling you. You don't want to think the worst. But the signs are there. Almost like a constant whisper in the back of your mind. And here's where the truth hurts. Because you might be ignoring what's right in front of you. In this video, we're going to talk about those signs you often don't want to see, but that reflect a reality that's hard to face: infidelity. It's not always obvious, but there are details that give it away. I'm going to guide you through those signs that, no matter how small they seem, can be the beginning of an uncomfortable truth. But don't worry, because we won't just identify the problem. We'll also talk about how you can face it with a clear head. And most importantly, with dignity. My name is Celia, and if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. I promise that what's coming will not only surprise you, but will also give you the tools to better understand your situation and act wisely. Let's get started. 1. Excessive independence. When a woman starts to show sudden excessive independence, it can be unsettling. It's not just about having her own hobbies or personal space, which is completely healthy in a relationship, but rather a shift in the dynamic between you. What you used to enjoy together now seems like something she prefers to do alone, and that can raise some red flags. But before jumping to conclusions, the most important thing is how you choose to handle the situation. The key is not to react with jealousy or mistrust. Instead of asking, "Why don't you want to spend time with me anymore?" a more effective way to approach the issue is to express what's really bothering you. You could say something like, "I've noticed you've been doing more things on your own lately, and while I respect your space, it's made me feel a bit disconnected from you. I'd like to know how you feel about it, because I miss the moments we used to share." This type of comment isn't invasive or accusatory. It gives her the opportunity to talk about what's going on in her mind and heart without feeling attacked. Her response might surprise you. Maybe she's just going through a personal phase where she needs space. Or maybe there's something deeper that needs to be discussed. Another important point is not to obsess over the change. Give her time and space to reflect on her own feelings. If you rush to conclusions, you may create a barrier that makes it harder to reconnect. The best thing you can do is open the door to an honest conversation. Without pressure. She may just be trying to reconnect with herself. But by keeping the lines of communication open, you're also showing that you're there to reconnect with her when she's ready. Finally, it's important to remember that not all changes in a person's independence are signs of infidelity. Sometimes people simply need time to process their emotions or their personal situation. The key is not to let uncertainty or fear drive your reaction. Instead of feeding insecurity, use the doubt as a bridge to a conversation that could clarify the direction of your relationship and hopefully reignite the connection you both once had. 2 incoherent stories, a little lies. It's interesting how sometimes our instincts speak to us before we can put into words what's bothering us. Let's call it intuition. That sixth sense that alerts us when something doesn't add up. Even if the signs are small, we notice them. And one of the most subtle, yet telling, is when the stories don't line up, or when little lies appear seemingly harmless, but they start to cast a shadow of doubt. Imagine, she tells you she went out to dinner with some friends on Friday. Everything sounds normal, nothing out of place. But a few days later in casual conversation, she mentions that the same dinner actually happened on Thursday. A small slip-up, maybe. But if you're paying attention, you start recalling other inconsistencies, small changes, in her stories that don't quite match up. Details that when added together begin to form a pattern. This is where you need to pause. Not because every little error in her story is a sign of infidelity, but because repeated inconsistencies could be an indication that something else is going on beneath the surface. People aren't perfect, and we all make mistakes when recalling things. But when those little lies start to pile up, they might be covering something she doesn't want you to know. The challenge here is not to fall into paranoia. It's easy to get caught up in the details and start imagining scenarios. But the practical thing to do is, before jumping to confrontations or hasty conclusions, observe calmly and give yourself space to confirm whether these inconsistencies are really pointing to a bigger issue. Are they happening frequently? Are they accompanied by changes in attitude or emotional distance? When the time comes to address it, instead of approaching with suspicion or accusations, it's best to express your concern openly and honestly, but from a place of calm. A good way to bring it up would be to say something like, "I've noticed that some of the details in what you tell me don't quite match up, and it's left me feeling a bit concerned. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I'd like to understand better what's going on." This way of framing, it isn't confrontational. It gives her space to reflect and explain herself without feeling attacked. Maybe it's just simple errors in her stories. Or perhaps there's something deeper that needs to be discussed. But by opening the conversation with respect, you give her the opportunity to be honest without feeling cornered. Sometimes those little lies hide insecurities or issues that haven't yet been addressed in the relationship. The trick is knowing when and how to act, avoiding premature accusations. In the end, it's about preserving trust, which is the foundation of any healthy relationship. Because those small inconsistencies, if left unaddressed, can grow into cracks that, at worst, can destroy what the two of you have built together. 3. Defensive or aggressive responses to questions. When simple questions that used to be part of everyday life start to trigger discomfort or sharp responses, it's natural to feel confused. What used to be a smooth conversation now feels like a minefield, where any question seems to spark a reaction. That change, in tone from open and close to guarded and defensive, can be alarming. But before jumping to conclusions, it's important to understand what might be happening beneath the surface. Imagine asking how her day at work was, or how her night out with friends went, expecting the usual response. But instead, you're met with a curt reply, an evasive answer, or even an over-the-top reaction, as if you're invading her privacy. It's unsettling, because these are questions that didn't cause conflict before. When you start noticing these reactions repeatedly, it's easy to think that something is being hidden from you. Defensive reactions to simple questions are often a protective mechanism, a way to divert attention from what might really be going on. However, it's not always about infidelity. We all have moments of stress or personal issues that make us more sensitive. But when this becomes a pattern, it's something worth paying attention to. This is where your approach becomes key. Instead of responding with confrontation, which only makes things worse, the goal is to show understanding and concern, not mistrust. A useful way to approach it might be something like, "I've noticed you've been getting defensive lately. When I ask you simple things, I don't want you to feel like I'm questioning you, but I'm concerned that something might be bothering you, and you're not sharing it with me. Is there anything you'd like to talk about?" This type of approach does two things. First, it allows her to reflect on her own attitude without feeling attacked. And second, it opens the door to a deeper conversation, without creating an accusatory atmosphere. The important thing is for her to know you're not looking for conflict, but rather trying to understand what's going on inside her. It's crucial to choose the right moment for this conversation. If you bring it up right after an argument or when tensions are high, the situation is likely to escalate instead of being resolved. Choose a calm moment, when you can both talk openly and calmly. These kinds of dialogue should be rooted in empathy and connection, not pressure or control. In summary, don't ignore the signs, but don't act impulsively either. If defensiveness and aggression become a constant response, it's essential to address the issue with sensitivity, because sometimes behind that hardness, there may be something deeper, and the only way to uncover it is through honest and open conversation, or increased attention to appearance. I remember a friend of mine, Martha, with whom I used to talk a lot about her relationship. She and her husband had been married for several years, and while it wasn't perfect, it always seemed stable. At least that's what we all thought. Until one day I started noticing something different about her. Suddenly, she was putting a lot more effort into her appearance than usual. She began buying new clothes, using makeup she'd never worn before, and started going to the gym almost daily. At first I thought she just wanted to feel better about herself, which is completely normal, especially as the years go by. But over time her change became more noticeable. She went from being someone who didn't pay much attention to those details to someone almost obsessed with her image. Every time I saw her, there was something new. A different hairstyle, tighter clothes, even changes in her style that didn't quite seem like her. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and told me she just wanted to look better. But something in the way she said it didn't convince me. What stood out the most was when her husband, in a casual conversation, mentioned that she was always in a rush to leave, that she no longer asked for his opinion on what to wear, or how she looked, something she used to do. Instead of sharing that process with him, she did it on her own, as if she no longer cared about what he thought. Her image makeover, which at first seemed like a positive thing, had become a barrier between them. A few months later, the truth came out. Martha wasn't just changing her appearance for herself. There was someone else in her life. That extra effort in her looks wasn't just about self-esteem. It was an attempt to impress someone new. Her husband hadn't wanted to see the signs, those small warnings that something was shifting in their relationship. And by the time he realized it, it was too late. The problem with these sudden changes is that we often prefer to believe they're simply part of a natural process. And sometimes they are. It's normal for a woman to want to feel attractive and take care of her appearance. But when that change becomes abrupt, excessive, and no longer shared, especially after years of being comfortable as she was, it could be a sign that she's seeking attention or validation elsewhere. What happened to Martha and her husband is a reminder that when we notice these kinds of changes, it's important not only to observe, but also to have an honest conversation. Not to jump to hasty conclusions, but to understand where that sudden desire for renewal is coming from. Because sometimes what looks like a simple change in style may be hiding a much more painful truth. If you feel like you're discovering new ways to interpret those signs we often overlook, I invite you to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button. By doing so, you support my work and motivate me to keep sharing the space for reflection, and I would truly appreciate it. Stay with me until the end, because the most important part is still to come. If you're looking to better understand your partner, and strengthen that connection in a genuine and deep way. The ninth sign I'll share at the end could give you a new perspective that might transform how you see your relationships. And tell me, where are you listening from? I'd love to know who's on the other side. Let's continue. 5. More time at work on new friends. One of the clearest signs that something isn't right in a relationship is when she suddenly starts spending more time at work or begins mentioning new friends with whom she's spending hours that she used to dedicate to the relationship. It's normal for friendships to form in the workplace, and we all understand that work can demand extra effort at times. But when this becomes a recurring excuse to justify her absence, it's time to pay attention. Think about it before. If she had to work late, she would usually let you know in advance. Maybe even invite you to pick her up or call you when she left. Now, out of the blue, there are unplanned overtime hours, last-minute meetings or dinners with colleagues you've never heard of. What's worse, when you try to learn more about these friends or events, the answers are vague or lacking in detail. It feels like you're being kept out of an important part of her life. When she used to share everything with you, it's possible she's genuinely going through a more demanding period at work. But if those new friends she talks about start to become a regular part of her routine without you knowing much about them, or if the details remain blurry, it's time to ask questions. Not in an accusatory way, but with genuine curiosity. After all, people who are really part of her life should be people you're at least somewhat familiar with, by name or through casual conversation. Another thing to observe is whether she used to talk enthusiastically about her day at work, but now seems more reserved or evasive. When you ask about those new friends or her long hours, if her social circle is changing and you're no longer part of the conversation, it could be a sign that something is being kept from you. It's not about panicking over every change in her work or social life. But if you notice that her time away from home is increasing, and these new friends are becoming more important than you, without a clear explanation, it's time to have a serious conversation. Not because work or friendships are wrong, but because her disconnection from the relationship might be hiding something more. The key is to stay present and attentive. Not to control her, but to understand if her life has taken a direction that, as her partner, you have the right to know about. 6 changes in sexual life. One of the most intimate, yet revealing aspects of a relationship is the sexual life. When there's a significant change in the frequency or quality of intimate encounters, it's impossible not to notice that something is different. The tricky part is that these changes can go in 2 directions. Either there's a drastic decrease in desire or an unusual, sudden increase on one hand. If physical intimacy becomes less frequent or almost disappears, it's a clear sign of emotional disconnection. It's not uncommon that when someone is investing their emotional and physical energy elsewhere, the relationship suffers. The lack of desire could stem from guilt, lack of interest, or the fact that this need is already being met somewhere else. This type of withdrawal isn't always immediate, but when encounters begin to feel forced or become non-existent, it's an indicator that something is off. On the other hand, a sudden increase in desire can also be a sign. It might seem contradictory, but sometimes someone who is being unfaithful may try to compensate for their guilt by being more physically active in the relationship. It may seem like they're more interested than ever. But this increase in frequency could be driven by feelings of guilt or an attempt to distract from their behavior outside the relationship. It's as if they're trying to prove to themselves or to you that everything is fine, when in reality, they're hiding something deeper. Neither of these changes is definitive proof, but they are signs that shouldn't be ignored. Sexual life reflects what's happening emotionally within the couple. And when something changes so drastically, it's important to pause and reflect. This might be the right time to ask if something is affecting the relationship, and above all, to address any emotional disconnect that might be occurring. The key here is communication. It's not about demanding explanations or making accusations, but about understanding that, when intimacy changes dramatically, it can be a symptom of something deeper. The important thing is to approach it with empathy and openness, without ignoring what you're feeling. Because when sexual life changes significantly, it often reflects an emotional shift that can't and shouldn't be overlooked. 7. Emotional distance. Emotional distance is one of the most painful and, at the same time, most silent signs that can appear in a relationship. It's not something that happens overnight. But little by little, you notice that something has changed. In the way she interacts with you, the deep conversations, the ones where you shared your most intimate thoughts, begin to fade. In their place, everything becomes more superficial, more distant. You feel that even though she's beside you, she's no longer truly present. When a woman starts to emotionally disconnect, it's a sign that something important is missing in the relationship. Maybe she no longer tells you about her day the way she used to. Or when you talk about something meaningful to you, she seems distracted or disinterested. There might even be moments when she avoids any type of conversation that could bring you closer emotionally. This kind of coldness, this distance shouldn't be ignored. Think about the little signs. She no longer seeks your advice. Like before, she's not interested in what you think or feel. And when you try to open up a deeper conversation, she seems evasive. All of this could be an indication that she's seeking that emotional connection elsewhere. Infidelity doesn't always start in the physical realm. Many times, the first step is an emotional disengagement. This kind of disconnection can be devastating because it affects the very foundation of the relationship. Trust and intimacy. It's not just that there's less communication. It's that the bond you once had feels like it's starting to fade. And the worst part is the more you try to get closer, the more it feels like she's pulling away. The danger here is letting that distance grow without taking action. The most common mistake is to ignore the problem, or think that it's just a passing phase. But when emotional distance sets in, it becomes much harder to reconnect. The best way to act in this case is to address the issue before it becomes unbearable. It's not about confronting with reproaches, but about creating a space to talk about what's happening before it's too late. Because while physical distance may be obvious, emotional distance is much more subtle, yet just as destructive, and if it's not addressed in time, it can be the precursor to something more serious, like infidelity or the eventual breakdown of the relationship. 8. Excessive and secretive phone or social media use. Excessive use of the phone or social media, especially when it wasn't a habit before, can be a clear sign that something is going on. If you notice that she suddenly takes her phone everywhere, guards it more carefully, or keeps it face down on the table, it's natural to start wondering why. It's not just about how often she uses it, but how she does it. Maybe before, she leave her phone out in the open without a second thought. But now she seems more protective of it, and any attempt to see who's texting her might lead to a defensive reaction. Changes in passwords, hiding her phone, or leaving the room to answer messages are signs that shouldn't be ignored. But the challenge here is how to approach the situation without coming across as if you're spying or distrusting her without reason. What's important to understand is that if this behavior is new and comes along with other signs of disconnection, she might be using her device to keep in touch with someone else, away from your knowledge. The key is to find a balanced way to address the situation, instead of jumping straight into accusations. A good way to start the conversation is by approaching it from a place of concern, rather than confrontation. You could say something like, "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time on your phone lately, and guarding it more than usual. It's made me feel a bit disconnected. Is everything okay?" This question isn't invasive, but it allows you to open the dialogue in an honest and direct way. It's not about controlling her or demanding to see her messages, but about expressing how you feel about the change. Maybe she's not doing anything wrong, but if she is, this question could prompt her to reflect on her behavior and offer an honest explanation. The worst thing you can do in these situations is to ignore what's bothering you. Or on the other hand, start investigating on your own. Snooping only creates more mistrust. And if something really is going on, the best way to deal with it is through a frank conversation. So if you notice that her phone use has become a sensitive topic in your relationship, it's time to ask, but do so with respect and genuine concern. Not suspicion, because if she's hiding something, that conversation will be the first step toward uncovering the truth. 9 sudden changes in routine. One of the most alarming and difficult to ignore signs is sudden changes in her daily routine. Late arrivals without a clear explanation. Overtime at work that suddenly becomes more frequent. Or outings with friends you've never heard of before. These things might seem harmless if they happen occasionally, but when they become constant, it's natural to start questioning what's really going on. I remember a couple in a similar situation. At first she said she had to stay a little longer at work. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then those days became more frequent. Work meetings extended later. And suddenly there were new friends with whom she spent her weekends. What was strange is that, until that point, she hadn't shown any interest in those activities or mentioned those people before. It all felt forced, as if she was filling her schedule with excuses. When behavior patterns change in this way, it's important to pay attention. I'm not suggesting you track every move, but it's worth noticing the excuses or reasons she gives. If she suddenly has a packed calendar full of events, activities or commitments that she never mentioned before, and this becomes a regular thing, it's a red flag. It's normal that, at some point in the relationship, both of you will have interests or friends the other might not know about. But when the explanations become vague or inconsistent, it's time to ask questions. A practical way to handle this is to approach her without judgment, but with honesty. You might say something like, "I've noticed that lately you've been spending a lot of time out with people, or doing things you didn't mention before. I'm concerned that this is affecting our relationship. Can we talk about what's going on?" This question is open and direct, giving her the chance to explain without feeling attacked, while also letting her know you've noticed the change. What you want to avoid is falling into the trap of silent suspicion, the kind that makes you doubt everything but keeps you from voicing it. Holding on to your concerns only feeds resentment and paranoia. It's better to address the situation sooner rather than later, calmly, and out of concern for how her behavior is affecting the relationship. Because when someone starts seeking time away from the relationship and justifies it with activities that never interested them before, it's clear that something has changed. And it's much better to address those changes before that physical and emotional distance becomes a gap too wide to bridge. It's important to remember that these signs, as unsettling as they may seem, are not definitive. Every relationship, every couple story has its own nuances, could have a completely different explanation in another. And what may be a red flag in one case It's not about jumping to conclusions or letting fear and insecurity take over. The key lies in communication, in taking the time to observe, but also to ask questions with respect and love, not with suspicion or control. If you've noticed some of these changes, my advice is clear: don't act impulsively. Instead of confronting with anger or hurt, find the right moment for a sincere conversation. Sometimes what's needed is an accusation, but listening to truly understand what's going on. What you're seeing may not be infidelity, but rather an emotional disconnection that needs to be addressed before it's too late. In the end, the most important thing is to act wisely, without tearing down what you've built together over an unconfirmed suspicion. Every little decision counts. And patience, dialogue, and empathy will always be your best allies. My name is Celia, and I want this to be a place of wisdom, where we can discuss these important topics openly, but always with respect together. I hope we can find ways to improve our everyday lives, not just in intimate relationships, but in everything we do, because in the end, every small change we make in ourselves reflects in our relationships and our overall well-being. If this is your first time on the channel, I invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming topics we'll be covering. And if you've made it this far, it means you take your personal growth seriously, and that deserves recognition. So to know who made it to the end, comment the phrase "I love wisdom" and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to read your messages and see who's with me on this journey of self-discovery. And don't leave without sharing this video with your loved ones. Maybe there's someone in your life who needs to hear these words today and find a new perspective. Sometimes a small piece of advice can make a big difference. See you in the next video.